A poor farmer with nothing but the clothes on his back risks everything to drag an injured wolf out of a frozen trap in the dead of winter, knowing one wrong move could cost him his hand or his life, and months later that same wolf appears at his doorstep in the middle of a blizzard carrying something in its mouth that makes this lonely man fall to his knees and weep because what this wild animal remembered and what it chose to do will shake you to your core. So stay with me because I need you to hear how this moment came to be and why it changed both of their lives forever. His name was Harold Jensen, and he was 62 years old when this story begins, living alone on a small farm in northern Minnesota where the winters hit so hard that the trees crack from the cold and the silence at night feels like it could swallow you whole. Harold had been a farmer all his life, just like his father and his grandfather before him, but unlike them he never had the blessing of a big family or the comfort of a partner to share the burden with because his wife Eleanor had passed away 7 years earlier from a sickness that took her slowly and took everything out of him in the process. After she was gone, Harold stopped going into town unless he absolutely had to, stopped calling his few remaining friends, and let the farm shrink down to just enough to keep him alive because living felt like a chore he wasn't sure he wanted to keep doing. The farmhouse was old and drafty, the barn needed repairs he couldn't afford, and most nights he sat by the wood stove with a cup of weak coffee staring at the empty chair across from him where Eleanor used to sit reading her books and humming old hymns. He had 2 chickens, a stubborn goat named Gus, and a vegetable garden that produced less each year because the soil was tired and so was he, and the truth is Harold wasn't just poor in money but poor in hope, and that kind of poverty is the heaviest weight a person can carry. It was late January when everything changed, during one of those brutal cold snaps where the temperature drops to 30 below and the sky turns a pale white that feels like a warning. Harold woke up early that morning because the fire had gone out and his fingers were numb, and after getting the flames going again he realized he was almost out of firewood, which meant he had to drag himself out to the edge of the property where he kept a pile of logs near the tree line. He bundled up the best he could, pulled on his worn-out boots, and trudged through the knee-deep snow with his axe over his shoulder and his breath freezing into tiny crystals the moment it left his mouth, and it was while he was stacking wood into his sled that he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then he heard it again, a low, pained whimper coming from somewhere deep in the trees, and everything in his gut told him to ignore it because whatever was making that sound was either dying or dangerous, and neither one of those situations was something he wanted to get involved in. But Harold paused, axe in hand, heart pounding in his chest, because the sound was so raw and so full of suffering that it pulled at something inside him that hadn't been touched in years. Against his better judgment, he walked toward the sound, moving slowly through the snow, pushing branches aside, until he came to a small clearing and saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There in the snow was a wolf, a full-grown grey wolf with a thick winter coat and amber eyes that seemed to glow even in the pale morning light, and it was caught in an old steel leg trap that some hunter must have set and forgotten about, and the wolf was lying on its side with its front leg twisted at a horrible angle and blood staining the snow around it. Harold had seen wolves from a distance before, heard them howling at night, knew they were part of this land just like the deer and the foxes, but he had never been this close to one and never seen one in pain like this. The wolf lifted its head when it saw him and let out a weak growl, baring its teeth just enough to show that even in this state it could still fight, and Harold felt his body freeze because he knew one bite from those jaws could rip his arm open and leave him bleeding out in the snow with no one around to find him. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the wind howling around them, the wolf's eyes locked on his, and then something shifted in that gaze, something that looked less like aggression and more like desperation, like a creature that had given up on fighting and was simply waiting for the end. Harold thought about Eleanor in that moment, thought about how she had looked at him the same way in her final weeks, that mix of pain and exhaustion and a quiet plea for mercy, and before he could talk himself out of it he was moving toward the trap. His hands were shaking, and not just from the cold, as he knelt down in the snow a few feet from the wolf's head, and he talked to it the way he used to talk to Eleanor when she was too weak to respond, soft and low and steady, saying things like "Easy now, and I'm not going to hurt you, and just let me help, and please don't bite me." The wolf watched him but didn't move, its breathing shallow, its body trembling from pain and cold and exhaustion, and Harold reached out with hands that had done 1,000 difficult things on this farm but nothing as terrifying as this. The trap was old and rusted, the kind that snaps shut with brutal force and doesn't let go, and Harold had to use all his strength to pry the jaws apart while keeping his face as far from the wolf's mouth as possible, and the whole time the wolf just lay there, watching him, not growling, not snapping, just watching like it understood what he was trying to do. When the trap finally released with a grinding screech, the wolf let out a sound that was somewhere between a yelp and a sigh, and Harold pulled it free as gently as he could, his glove soaked with blood, his heart hammering against his ribs. He expected the wolf to bolt the moment it was free, expected it to disappear into the forest and never look back, but instead it just lay there for a long moment, breathing, and then it did something that Harold would never forget as long as he lived. It lifted its head, looked directly into his eyes, and then slowly, carefully, it licked his hand, not a bite, not a warning, but something that felt like gratitude, and Harold felt tears sting his eyes because in that moment he didn't feel so alone anymore. He knew he couldn't take the wolf back to his farm, knew it was a wild animal that belonged in these woods, so he did the only thing he could do, which was back away slowly and watch as the wolf struggled to its feet, tested its injured leg, and then limped off into the trees without looking back. Harold stood there in the cold for a long time after it was gone, something stirring inside his chest that he hadn't felt in years, and when he finally made his way back to the farmhouse with his load of firewood he couldn't stop thinking about those amber eyes and that single moment of connection. In the weeks that followed, Harold returned to his usual routine, feeding the chickens, taking care of Gus, sitting by the fire alone at night. But something was different now because he found himself looking toward the tree line more often, wondering if the wolf had survived, wondering if the leg had healed, wondering if he had done enough. He started leaving scraps of food at the edge of the property, not much because he didn't have much to spare, just small offerings of whatever he could manage, and some mornings the food would be gone and he would see tracks in the snow and his heart would lift just a little bit. Winter dragged on the way it always did, long and cold and relentless, and by late February Harold was in trouble because the food supplies he had stored up were running low, the roads were impassable, and there was no way for him to get to town for more. He started rationing what he had, eating less so the animals could eat more, and some nights he went to bed hungry with his stomach cramping and his body weaker than it had been in months. He thought about his neighbors, but the nearest one was 5 miles away and in this weather that might as well have been 500, and he thought about calling for help but the phone lines had been down for a week, and he thought about giving up more than once because what was the point of fighting so hard to survive when there was nothing waiting for him on the other side? It was during the worst blizzard of the season that the wolf came back. Harold was huddled by the fire, wrapped in every blanket he owned, his body shaking from cold and hunger, when he heard a sound at the door. Not a knock but a scratching, persistent and deliberate, and at first he thought it was just the wind or a branch blown loose from a tree. But the sound continued, and then it was joined by something else, a howl, low and long, right outside his door, and Harold's blood ran cold because he knew that sound and he knew what it meant. He forced himself up on legs that didn't want to cooperate, grabbed the old rifle he kept by the door more out of habit than actual use, and slowly pulled the door open, ready for anything except what he actually saw. There in the swirling snow, illuminated by the pale light from inside, was the wolf, the same wolf he had saved 2 months ago, standing strong on all 4 legs with its winter coat thick and healthy and its amber eyes bright with intelligence. But that wasn't what made Harold gasp, that wasn't what made him lower the rifle and stare in disbelief, because there at the wolf's feet, dropped carefully in the snow, was a rabbit, freshly caught and still warm, an offering, a gift, and the wolf stood there with its head held high like it knew exactly what it was doing and why. Harold fell to his knees right there in the doorway, the cold forgotten, the hunger forgotten, everything forgotten except this moment and what it meant, because this wild creature that owed him nothing, this animal that should have disappeared into the wilderness and never looked back, had remembered his kindness and had come back to repay it. The wolf watched him for a long moment, and then it turned and disappeared into the blizzard, and Harold thought that was the end of it, but he was wrong because the next morning there was another rabbit at his door, and the morning after that there was a grouse, and every single day for the rest of that brutal winter the wolf returned with something to help him survive. Harold couldn't explain it to anyone, couldn't make sense of it himself, but he didn't need to because some things don't need explaining, some things just are, and this connection between him and this wolf was one of those things. As spring finally began to thaw the frozen land, Harold found himself stronger than he had been in years, not just physically but spiritually, because for the first time since Eleanor died he had a reason to wake up each morning and a purpose that went beyond just existing. He started repairing the farm, started reaching out to neighbors, started living again in ways he had forgotten were possible, and through it all the wolf remained a presence at the edge of his property, never tame, never domesticated, but always there, watching over him like a guardian he never asked for but desperately needed. One night in early spring, Harold heard howling in the distance and stepped out onto his porch to listen, and there in the moonlight he saw not one wolf but several. The grey wolf he had saved joined now by others, a pack that had accepted her back and followed her to this place where kindness lived. He raised his hand in a wave he knew they probably couldn't understand, but the grey wolf separated from the group and walked a few steps toward him, and in that moment their eyes met the same way they had on that cold January morning, and Harold felt the same thing he had felt then: connection, understanding, gratitude flowing in both directions. The wolf had repaid his kindness with loyalty that defied everything. People think they know about wild animals, had remembered a single act of mercy during her darkest hour and had turned it into a bond that would last the rest of their lives. Harold lived another 12 years after that winter, and every single one of those years the wolf would appear at the edge of his property in the coldest months, not to bring him food anymore because he didn't need it, but just to be there, just to remind him that he wasn't alone, just to prove that some connections transcend species and circumstance and everything else that's supposed to keep us apart. When Harold finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74, his neighbors found him with a small smile on his face, and outside his window in the fresh spring snow were wolf tracks leading away into the forest, as if something had come to say goodbye before returning to the wild where it belonged. This is the kind of story that reminds us why compassion matters, why kindness is never wasted, why the smallest act of mercy can ripple outward in ways we never expect and create bonds that last a lifetime. That wolf didn't understand human language or human concepts like debt or obligation, but it understood something deeper, something that lives in all of us if we let it, the simple truth that when someone saves your life you don't forget and you find a way to return the love you were given. So if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if you believe that animals remember kindness and that loyalty is the purest form of love, then comment loyalty down below and let me know you were here. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, someone who loves animals, someone who has felt alone, someone who needs a reminder that even in the coldest winters there is warmth waiting for those who keep their hearts open. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and I will see you in the next one.